Islam is not a religion of peace. Islam is a religion of conquest. You don't have that problem with non-Muslim immigrants from other parts of the world. Every country seems to have this problem, only with the Muslim communities. It's not racism, it's not prejudice, it's self-preservation.
Australia has some of the toughest gun laws in the world. Let's tighten our gun laws. That immediately offended many people who live in rural Australia because they said, well, why are we the target when we won't call out the people who did this, radical Islamists?
Look at what's going on in Iran, where you have protest after protest led by Iranian women fighting for their rights, and feminists are almost always 100% silent.
16 people killed at Sydney's most famous beach. What went through your mind when you heard about it?
It wasn't surprising.
My guest on this occasion is the remarkable Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. She's been an activist for women's rights and a brave and informed critic of Islamic immigration in the West. Her most recent book is Pray, Immigration, Islam and the Erosion of Women's Rights. Ayaan, thank you so very much for joining us. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for having me.
16 people killed at Sydney's most famous beach, Bondi, by a father and son team, Muslim extremists, plainly related to or inspired by ISIS, the worst, not the first, but the worst terrorism attack on our soil in our history. What went through your mind when you heard about it?
The same thing that has been going through my mind when these events take place, but especially that one, which was the event itself was shocking, horrifying, of course, but it wasn't surprising because in the lead up, actually from about October 8, 2023, Australia, like other Western countries, were faced with all these crazy demonstrations, these protests, so-called pro-Palestine, but really they were pro-Hamas and anti-Jewish. And there was this build-up of tension and the threats that something was going to happen against the Jewish community in Australia was, as in, by the way, as in other countries, those threats were imminent. And I remember the rabbi appealing to your prime minister saying, we need help. You have to help us. Something bad is going to happen. And unfortunately, I think that rabbi was actually killed in the attack. The thing is, these things are horrifying but not surprising. And I've seen anti-Semitism go up by, in some cases, 500%. In some countries, and Australia was one of those places. I was just surprised how fast that went.
I've said many times in the last couple of years that I'm frankly ashamed of the things that have happened in my country because this was such a wonderfully safe place for Jews to come for so long, particularly after the Holocaust. Some of our most remarkable people, for example, our greatest military leader, Sir John Monash from Melbourne, was Jewish, and he was perhaps one of the best 2 or 3 generals in the First World War and a very humane man who developed techniques for winning battles without losing lives. 2 of our governor generals, who both served with great distinction, have been Jewish. In every area of endeavour, the economy, arts, politics, treasury, they've made an enormous contribution. And yet here we were as a society arguing over whether the chants outside the Opera House were gas the Jews or where's the Jews. And there's really no difference. Anyone who knows anything about the history knows where's the Jews are the questions that the Nazis asked when they conquered a city and wanted to round up the Jews so they could take them to the gas chambers. There's no material difference. We don't seem to understand our history.
That's because history, the teaching of history in schools and through other channels like the media, through documentaries, all of that's been co-opted. It's been, your country, like many others, institutions have been infiltrated, especially those that are left-leaning. And the Islamists, in collusion with the Marxists, neo-Maoists, they have produced these narratives where they hide behind criticizing Israel or criticizing Zionism or criticizing Bibi Netanyahu. But actually what they're peddling is just good old-fashioned anti-Semitism. And those institutions fell for it. And so now you have people in leadership places that either don't know the history of anti-Semitism, can't recognize it if it hits them in the head, and then are complacent or at times even complicit. And that's very shocking, and it's horrifying, and it's going to take quite a bit of time for us to reverse this, and I hope we can.
Well, if we're going to reverse it, I think we have to be honest about what's happening. The first response here was, well, let's tighten our gun laws. Australia has some of the toughest gun laws in the world. Let's tighten our gun laws. That immediately offended many people who live in rural Australia, because they said, well, why are we the target because we have guns as part of our business, when we won't call out the people who did this, radical Islamists? And it seems to me that actually, if we're really honest about it, this in the end turns out to be a theological problem. The problem's not guns. It's not even primarily, I would put it, that we ought to think about this anti-Semitism or radical Islam. It's actually a theological question that we have forgotten who we are. We've forgotten what our values are. We've created an unbelievable vacuum into which all sorts of sloppy thinking, right through to, frankly, outright evil, can flourish.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. It is not the guns, because sometimes they use guns. It's not the cars, because sometimes they use cars. It's not the knives. It's not the suicide vests. It's not the chemicals that they put together when they use improvised explosives. It's their theological conviction, and it is our theological convictions that they're opposed to. They're opposed to Judaism and want to wipe it off the earth. They want to follow up with Christianity. A lot of atheists think that they are the exception. They are not. And so we have to understand, precisely as you put it, that first and foremost, this is a spiritual confrontation. And because we created this huge vacuum, and we allowed, therefore, our cultural institutions to be infiltrated and occupied, that we find ourselves on the defensive in our own societies. I mean, I'm an immigrant, I'm a very grateful immigrant, but I count myself as being a part of America, a part of the West, and of course, I'm enjoying this Western heritage, so I want to defend it. But it's very difficult to get Westerners to wake up.
We almost despise our heritage. Thomas Sowell observed that a civilization like ours doesn't fall out of the sky. It has to be built up. It has to be maintained. It has to be defended. But above all, he said, I found this very interesting, it has to be understood. And if it's not understood, at the very least, out of ignorance, you won't maintain it. At the worst, you'll come to despise it, because we tend to come to despise things we don't understand. And there's something deep in our culture, it seems to me, that actually has to be described as a hatred, an embarrassment about, even a hatred of Christianity in our own culture. We want to, oh shucks, no, we don't want to talk about those of our roots, because we don't believe that's all cringeworthy, but we're paying a terrible price because we've become so vacuous with it.
Yeah, Roger Scruton called it oikophobia. And I think you and I, we've seen it happen. People not only cringe, they feel embarrassed, Let's organize to do something about the crisis that we find ourselves in, the cultural crisis. Let's not mention Christianity. I mean, I have been in gatherings like that, and I think it's wrong and it's idiotic. You have to understand what you are defending. You also have to understand that, well, in some ways we've been fortunate in our enemies, because it's very difficult to attack. It's getting easier now, but when I came 30 years ago, 20 years ago, it was very difficult to attack Western countries militarily and defeat them. And so our enemies rely now on the weapon of the weak, which is subversion. And it becomes very, very easy to subvert societies that are open, liberal, that have generous welfare states, and that have zero understanding of exactly who they are. And so it's very easy in our own schools and through our own media channels to confuse and indoctrinate our youth. And not just our youth, by the way. I find people in the baby boomers categories who still don't know what's happening. Oh, Islam is a religion of peace, or, we have defeated communism. That's something of the past. It's no longer here. It must be the politics of Israel, or it must be our own politics. It must be something that we have done and something we got wrong, and that is why people hate us and people want us, they want to harm us. That excuse is entrenched. It's almost taken over the place of religion.
In Infidel, to go back there for a moment, as I recall it, you described your early childhood learning as consisting of, to a very great degree, sitting in the shade of a big carob tree, if I remember correctly, but certainly in the shade of a very big tree, repeating time and time and time, verse by verse, the Quran and related scriptures, the hadiths and so forth, on the basis, presumably, that repeated often enough, a young mind never forgets. It remains permanently embedded. The point I'm making is there's an astonishing contrast between the passing on of a culture's story to the next generation that is a feature of committed Muslim communities, but is almost virtually absent in Christianity. We don't pass on our story, and we have literally children now who go to school in this country who have not heard of the idea of a God. I mean, I've seen that actual work. They haven't heard that. And yet we're confronted with people who are deeply convicted. And conviction always wins out over a nebulous, sort of vacuous, unconvinced state.
Yeah. So in Infidel, I tell the story of how my identity was shaped. First, the clan identity, that's that big tree. My grandmother sitting me there and teaching me about my clan identity, which is basically your passport, really. It's who you are. It's in your DNA. I am Ayaan, who's the daughter of Hirsi, who's the son of, and, that gets inculcated into you. And it's the clan that protects you. And then alongside that, we would go to Quran school. And it was also the same method of transmission, which is memory. You memorize it and you're not allowed to question these things, and you take them as the truth. And then it's your job, your duty, not only to live by the clan code and by the Islamic code, Sharia, but to pass them on to your children wherever you are in the world. And so what you have in Australia, the same as what we have in the United States and in other Western countries, is those communities for whom ethnicity, the bloodline, and Islam are their formational identities, come to the West and then reconfigure in almost exactly the same ways. But in addition to that, this is predatory Islamist ideology that states that it wants to go into non-Muslim countries and Islamize them through immigration, by weaponizing immigration, by weaponizing the liberal system of openness. And for a long time, our leaders, the political leaders in the West, ignored it or downplayed it or turned the other way or focused only on combating the violence. So when 9/11, 2001, the US was hit with the terrorist attacks, the passenger planes, the response was military. And then when we found these terrorist attacks on our soils, the US, different parts of Europe, but also in Australia, again, the response was it was military, it was surveillance, it was intelligence, it was how do we prevent these plots from occurring? But there was this obstinacy, and it's still there, to recognize that the problem is rooted in Islam, Islamism is a product of Islam. And this political ideology and the intentions they have, the conviction that they must conquer, the conviction that they must destroy Jews, these are things that they spell out. They say this to their congregations in the infrastructure of mosques and youth camps and Muslim centers that they have built, and then they act on it. And every time we see a terrorist action like Bondi Beach, we get horrified, we pretend we are surprised, and then we go back to that interfaith dialogue where those who are representing the West can't even articulate what their faith is.
Exactly. Now, the last time you and I were together with a group of people, we were talking about the many strains of Islamic belief and also of commitment. And I recounted the story of how just that morning in London, on a long drive in an Uber, I'd had a Pakistani driver, very friendly man, very warm man. We had a great conversation. But part of our conversation centered on his beliefs. And he said, oh, my wife and I, we're Muslims, but we do not take it seriously. We never go to prayers. But, he said, I have 4 children and they go to school and they come home insisting on what is right and what is wrong. I didn't quite know how to pursue it, but he was plainly telling me that he and his wife were probably lukewarm on anything religious, as so many Britons are, but his children were not. They were taking their Islamic faith very seriously. This raises this question, I think, doesn't it, that people are determined to draw a distinction between what they call moderate Islam, which they say is harmless and peaceful, and extremist Islam, which everyone agrees is very dangerous. But whilst there's some truth to it, I suspect that it's not as simple as saying that Islam is a religion of peace. For a start, it is, I think, instinctively anti-Semitic.
Islam is not a religion of peace. Islam is a religion of conquest. So Muhammad was first and foremost and is remembered as a conqueror. He's the one who not only brought, by his own account in his biography, he says God spoke to him through the angel Jibril or Gabriel. And in Mecca, he convinced his wife, he convinced his best friend, and over a decade, through the method of simply speaking and trying to persuade without any violence, he had gained a following of about 200 people over a decade. Then he went to Medina, established a militia, and went back to conquer, to attack Mecca, the Meccans who had rejected his message. And he was very successful. And from there, for Islam, things went almost worldwide. Islam became an empire that fell only in 1924. And so that's the story that the Islamists tell. And the Islamists glorify Muhammad's conquests, and they want to continue those conquests. They glorify the treatment that Muhammad meted out to the Jews when he massacred them, and they want to repeat these things. When ISIS in 2014, 2015, when they conquered parts of parts of Syria and Iraq, and they started to do things that horrified us, like beheading people and enslaving Yazidi women, they were reenacting what they find in the biography of the Prophet Muhammad and in the Hadith and in the Quran. And so that's where things are at. And you can stick your head in the sand as long as you want. You can pretend you don't know this as long as you want, but that is a fact. That's the case. Now, having said all of this, there are millions of Muslims who are probably peaceful, like that Pakistani man. But when their children go to the mosque or the Muslim center or any kind of place where this Islamist ideology is being disseminated, the Islam they learn is the Islam of conquest. And I think the more we pretend we don't know this and that, it's not happening in Australia, it's not happening in England, it's not happening in America, the more we put ourselves, in a position of not just defensiveness, but weakness, and make ourselves prey to conquest.
The contrast, there would be many who would say, well, the Old Testament's quite violent. Christianity is it really any different? There's an intellectual laziness that people get away with in our culture because we don't understand our own foundational beliefs, as we've just discussed. But I think you would argue, and I would argue, that in fact there is a world of difference. If you blaspheme the name of the Muhammad, as we saw in the Charlie Hebdo case, you are a worthy target for terrorism. Contrast that actually with the founder of Christianity, as he's arrested and about to be taken off to a complete sham trial and crucifixion. A disciple slices off his ear, and the New Testament says that Jesus replaced it and strictly instructed his followers never to undertake violence in his name. It seems to me there's a world of difference, but it's just absolutely glossed over by secularists who want to. It's dying now. Things are changing, but it was certainly the case after 9/11. And this sort of pox on all religions are all equally bad or equally cringeworthy. In fact, they are chalk and cheese.
They're chalk and cheese, and I think this is this whole story of multiculturalism and cultural relativism, and this. Sometimes I trace it back to the 1960s, but some people say, no, you have to go farther back, early 20th century, late 19th century. Some people trace it all the way back to the French Revolution. Some people trace it all the way back to the Enlightenment. But in any case, yes, this secularization of the West and the watering down of Christianity, and then over time, simply turning our backs on Christianity and saying it's, if anything, just, like a superstitious accessory for some people, and we can ignore it. And I think that is when our troubles begin. And this, when we adopt the idea that all cultures are equal, that there's nothing special or unique about the West, we stop explaining why the West has advanced more than all other civilizations, and why the advancements of the West have spread, the benefits have spread to the rest of the world. When we stop doing that and we stop rooting that in Christian principles, in Judeo-Christian biblical principles, I think that's when we start to get into trouble, and then we are sucked into the enjoyment of the material outcomes the West has achieved. And I think now that we are, this material wealth is dwindling. And because we've, in some ways, I think we wasted it, we're still wasting it. But materialism cannot answer that spiritual hunger. And it doesn't give anyone conviction to fight or defend anything. And so now we're faced with forces outside of the West, but established in the West, driven by conviction. And we're fighting amongst ourselves as to whether maybe it is good manners to talk about our faith or not. And that's sad. And as you said, it is changing. And there are many people who've contributed to that change, but we are nowhere near, we're at the very early stages of that change.
You gave an utterly brilliant talk, it was, and I do commend it to our listeners and viewers, at ARC in January, 12 months ago or so, in London, at the ARC conference, Alliance of Responsible Citizens, in which you pointed to a couple of things that you articulated brilliantly. The nation state as the logical body upon which you can engage or you can build a prosperous and free society on the back of engaged and vibrant citizens. But you also talked about the vast differences in the societies that Christianity has created and Islamic societies have thrown up. One of the fundamental differences, of course, is that Christianity is essentially informs people, I suppose you'd say, and that shapes their thinking about government, and you can see that in the history of the West. But it draws a clear distinction between that which is Caesar's and that which is God. gods. Government should actually be secular in one sense in the West. Church and state should be separated. There is no such distinction, as I understand it, in the Islamic world at all. That in many ways, Islam has to be thought of as, and the Quran as much a political movement as it is, in fact, a religious one.
Oh, absolutely. Islam was founded in an Arab pastoral raiding society. They had seasons where they would go and raid each other. And so, and Muhammad said when he came that the law of man is the law of God. So there is no, he objected to, he diminished the lawmaking capacity of man. And so the Quran and the Hadith, that is Sharia. That's God's law, and it must be, it's not just that the believer observes these laws, but it's the duty of the believer to spread them by good means, through persuasion, da'wah, or by violence. In other words, by all means necessary. So yes, it's a political doctrine. There is no separation of politics from anything else, no separation from politics and religion, politics and science, politics or religion and science, religion and anything. The religion is the political manifesto. And so that's radically different from Christianity and Christ, who comes in a context within the Roman Empire. There was already an empire established, and Christ never said you should overthrow the emperor. In fact, he said quite the opposite. And so from the very beginning, the teachings of Christ were, love thy neighbor is all about collaborating with one another. I think that creates a context, this love thy neighbor, if you take it seriously. It contributes to a culture of collaboration, a culture of setting aside your pride, setting aside your differences. And it's therefore conducive to building things, leaving things for posterity, leaving things for the other. And Islam is very different. Islam spread very quickly, became an empire. But when Islam is not conquering, as you saw in the later stages of every Islamic empire that declined and fell, when they're not conquering, they're not building. And so the decay sets in and then it collapses.
I think in some ways what I'm driving at, and these are ill-formed thoughts, but it seems to me really important that we try and understand, as we grapple in countries like Australia with securing people's religious freedoms, we have to recognise the vast difference between the two. I can illustrate it perhaps by a conversation that I had in about 2002 or 3. I was acting Prime Minister at the time. The Prime Minister was on holidays, and it fell to me to meet with a very interesting guest who was in Australia talking about oil exploration. At the time, he was studying at LSE in London, one Saif Gaddafi.
Yeah.
And we ran out of conversation quite early on. And I thought, well, in for a penny, in for a pound. I asked him this question. I said, if it's not offensive, may I ask you whether a believing and practicing Muslim can truly embrace participatory voting democracy? And I was astonished, Ayaan, because I essentially got a 35-minute dialogue, which contained, I think, more than anything else, I think the argument was, no, not really. We don't believe in a democracy. We believe in a theocracy where the mullahs, the judges, if that's not a misinterpretation of the word, the judges interpret the word and the will of Allah. You don't need parliaments. So, no, he said, we don't really believe in parliamentary democracy. Now, even, I think that troubles me deeply as a very committed Democrat. Even moderate Muslims, I think, need to be challenged. Can you, will you really embrace parliamentary democracy and the separation of faith and state? I obviously am a believing Christian. I support Christians being involved in public life. I think their perspective is very important. If they understand their faith, they will be guided by the very thing that you just referred to, the instruction to love your neighbour as yourself. But they will also understand that secular government is downstream of, if you like, the higher morality and the higher being of the Christian God and his views on how we should live. And it's there for the good ordering of society and to, if you like, punish those who do the wrong thing in the interests of the freedom and security of others. Now, that's a long-winded way of saying that I think we need to come to grips with this issue if we're to ever try and describe what is religious freedom and outlaw that which goes beyond legitimate questions, which I think are the ultimately important ones, as it happens, of belief. Who am I? What am I here for? Does my life have any purpose?
I think if I were to carry on, through with the dialogue you just described, where the Muslim, his clergyman, explains to you why, for a true believing Muslim, participating in a democracy and obeying man-made laws is un-Islamic. I think I would follow up with a question of, well, therefore, what would your life mean if you were here in Australia? Would you participate and live here peacefully? Would you accept our political arrangements, or would you seek to change those? Now, many Islamists have actually been honest with us, and I've sat through some of those conversations where they say, no, they cannot bear to participate in secular man-made laws, and they would seek to change them. And then the way they do it, I'm not talking about the ones who use violence, but the ones who seek this gradualist process, establishing mosques and youth camps, and we wanted to change these liberal societies from within, and we wanted to Islamize them, and this is the manner in which we want to do them. The question then for you as an acting prime minister or any other political leader would be, is it prudent to allow this gradualist process to take place and to occur in our societies? What is it about our constitutions that has this inbuilt suicidal thing in it? And I would have, if you come in and you say you openly want to subvert our system, I would have some kind of protective measure to remove, politely, not horribly or anything, but to say, I'm sorry, Sharia law and the establishment of Sharia law through any process, whether it's sudden or gradual, is unacceptable. And we suggest you go back to a country where Sharia law applies. And so that would be my conversation. That would be my advice to you. But that is, I think, when you get to Western leaders and they start, they recoil and they say, but it is against the Constitution to stop even such a process from occurring. And that's the dilemma we have. We have to have constitutional conventions that allow for protections against ideological subversions of the existing order.
I'd like to come back to that in a moment. There's another question, though, that I would like to just, before we leave what happened at Bondi, we have seen, a lot of writing about how this is not real Islam. This is only those who are radicalized. The Prime Minister has had immense difficulty even talking about radical Islam, which I think has cost him a great deal of sympathy in the Australian community, because everybody else can see we've got a problem with radical Islam. But, a lot of the chants we've heard that reek of hatred are quite explicit in not just their anti-Semitism, but in their stated desire to destroy the state of Israel and to kill off Jews everywhere. Yet, and I saw a young lady do this the other day, what does Islam say about, and then they go to Dr. Google. So AI will tell you, if you ask, is it right for a Muslim to take a life, that it's absolutely wrong. Under no circumstances that Muslim faith says that it's completely inappropriate to take another life except in limited circumstances of self-defense and so forth. But there's an interesting little hook in a lot of it. It's referring to the lives of the innocent. Is there a distinction between the innocent, and if so, who are the innocent and who are not the innocent? And is it all right to take the lives of the non-innocent?
The innocent are Muslims, fellow Muslims. So you're not allowed to take the life of the innocent, meaning those who are truly Muslim. And it's the same way the word peace is used in Islam. The assumption is peace is for those who've accepted Islam. And those who reject Islam, Jews, Christians, atheists, others, Hindus, Buddhists, whatever, if they reject Islam, then we're in a state of war with them. And they are not innocent, but they are those who've rejected. They're the enemy. And therefore, it's the obligation, it's the duty of the Muslim man to go after them and convince them. Try persuasive means first, and then use the ultimate persuasion, which is coercion, or face death. And if they are to face death, then kill them. That is what it means.
It's a little warning of the dangers of AI in a way, because unless you ask the right questions, you'll get very misleading information.
Well, a lot of these large language models have been trained on leftist and Islamist and other rubbish. And so that's also what they generate. And I like AI. But I like all kinds of technology, and I think that's something that can be corrected. And I know that there are some people who are trying to make these improvements.
We have seen in this country under the current government, and I shouldn't seek to involve you in a local political toing and froing, but over the last since October 2023. As is widely known right over the world, Australia has moved its position on Israel enormously. There was almost no reaction to the outpouring of pro-Hamas activity on our streets. We've recognised Palestine. How you do that when a state doesn't exist, I don't know. It's technically not possible. But there's been, if you like, a constant repudiation of Israel, and people will always argue, oh, well, that's not anti-Semitic, it's anti-Israel. But 80% of Australian Jews are Zionists. They do believe, and I believe, in the state of Israel. So in that sense, if that makes me a Zionist, I'm a Zionist. This raises the question of the tone that is set and the license that is given by the way that national leaders behave.
Unfortunately, yes, because, again, I'm not really an expert in Australian politics, but I know that in some of these other Western countries, politicians, especially those on the center left, have come to depend on the Muslim vote as a bloc. And the Muslim vote as a bloc is organized by the Islamists, and in particular by various organizations that are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists, they disseminate the most vile prejudice and hatred of Israel, Zionism, and Jews. And if you combine all of these things, you have to wonder, this leftist politician, is he truly anti-Semitic, or does he just want the vote? My conclusion for many years has been they just want the vote, and they think they can have the vote without any policy consequences. So they accept this block vote. This will get me into office. And then I can ignore the wishes of the Islamists who helped me get into office. Well, that's not how it works. The Islamist is going to come and demand that the Holocaust no longer be taught, that the foreign policy of your country towards Israel change. You may have heard of BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction, which is this so-called pro-Palestinian movement that is trying to delegitimize Israel in every way possible. Many demand that the Holocaust not be taught in schools, and just other active propaganda against Israel, against Zionism, against Jews. And so is that what's happening in Australia? Is your Prime Minister and the Labour Party in Australia, are they beholden to that Muslim ethnic vote or not? If not, another explanation might be there is just this large, to the far left, and this is where the Red-Green Alliance comes in, where there is this odd anti-Zionism. They say it's anti-Zionism, but it really boils down to anti-Semitism anyway, where again, Jews are demonized because in this decolonization narrative and multicultural narrative that they advance, they divide the world into oppressor and oppressed, and the oppressor is the white man, and they categorize Jews and Israelis as white, and the state of Israel as a settler colonial country that has to be removed. And so when you have these Islamists holding hands with the leftists, you're then left as a political leader on the moderate left or not moderate, even far left, with policies, with a posture towards Israel that is very different from the traditional post-war posture that all Western countries had towards Israel, which was to defend the legitimacy of Israel as a state, the legitimacy of Zionism, and then within Western borders, the promise of never again because of what had happened in the Holocaust and the commitment to keep teaching young generations about the Holocaust so it's never repeated. All of that's repudiated by this unholy alliance between the left and Islamists.
The settler oppressor model intellectually holds no water at all, and I wonder how many academics can sleep with themselves at night when they advance it. Point one is, of course, that there were Jewish people long before there were Muslim people in that part of the Middle East, thousands of years ago. That's point one. They were deprived one way or another, forced out, persecuted. Secondly, have any group of people in the entire history of mankind been more oppressed than the Jewish people themselves? Have we really forgotten what they've been through and the horrors of the 20th century so quickly?
Well, the question you asked is a question for the education systems, right? It's an audit of what is going on in these schools. What's in the textbooks? What are children being taught? What's going on in the universities? We have ways and means of transmitting information and knowledge onto the next generations. And those channels have been corrupted. And so that's what kids are taught. They're not taught about. We started our conversation with, is the Bible even taught? So no one knows, very few people know anything about the Old Testament. That's where the place that we call Israel. And then there's Greater Israel, not this tiny narrow place, but Greater Israel, where the areas where the Jews lived for 2,000 years and more. Is that even taught? Even is the most recent history, just the history of the Second World War, is that taught beyond, only talking about Hitler? I mean, even the way these analogies, historical analogies, are made today in America. The Somalis of Minnesota are being held responsible for some of the fraud that they committed. And in response, they're saying, well, we're being treated like Jews in the 1930s. Really? Do you know anything about how the Jews were treated in the 1930s? Are you kidding me? So this perversion of history. This history the Western history has been made superficial. And then it's actively subverted. And that's what we have. I think that's the proper reckoning. That question you asked is probably the most important question. What's going on in our school systems?
Yeah. Wow. a great deal that is not helpful. We know that. Just though to keep the ball rolling, you've been very active in researching the social effects, if you like, of Islamic immigration for many years. Apart from the things we've been talking about, the terrorist acts and what have you, what tends to follow large-scale Islamic immigration in Western countries, and in particularly for women? I'm thinking, and you've touched on this, I mean, I understand that there are somewhere between 20 and 25 people in the British Parliament now who are there because of the Muslim vote. And a couple of researchers told me recently they thought it would be 45 by the mid-2030s. That's enough to swing a parliament. You've touched on that, to say no more teaching the Holocaust in schools. It would be enough to say Sharia law has equal standing with the common law in Great Britain. That completely changes Britain forever.
I mean, it has changed. They have Sharia courts. People are standing now in British Parliament saying, well, cousin marriage can be legalized. There's a lot of change, and that's where the numbers grow. The change is at first gradual enough for it to be dismissed, and then it's very sudden. And it is fait accompli. It's like, well, it's happened. The Sharia tribunals are there. Nothing to be done about that. Sorry. And so, there's this transformation that is occurring because of the demographic change, because of the political clout that they develop, because of the, you only have, in Western societies, you have center-left parties and center-right parties. And if you co-opt one of the two, which the Islamists have done successfully, for instance, in Britain, then you just have to wait long enough in the opposition. And then when the center-left comes to power and they're brought into power with the Islamist vote, then they have to cater to, and then you have that sudden change. But I also saw it in the US. I mean, the Democratic Party, suddenly from being the most pro-Jewish, in fact, the Democratic being the political home of the Jewish people in America, it was just in one election that suddenly the politics towards Israel, towards Jews, everything changed. And now New York, the largest number of Jewish people outside of Israel lived in New York. I don't know if they're still there, but now they have an Islamist Maoist mayor. So if you want me to illustrate how fast these transformations can happen, it's staggering. That's how fast they can happen. If you sleep throughout when the change is occurring, and that's what people have been doing. We were sleeping. Well, I wasn't sleeping, but
You've observed many times that the left, and even women on the left, refuse to admit that Islam is a problem in the West. I still cannot understand why feminists, by and large, have been so hospitable to Islam.
Feminism became a weapon of the far left, of these communist, Maoist groups, of these people who were advancing the idea of oppressor and oppressed, where women are presented as a group who are victims of the oppressed, or of the oppressor, and this oppressor is the white male and the white straight male. In that narrative, feminism is not about defending and protecting the rights of women. It's about advancing the neo-communist Maoist agenda. And you see this illustrated, I think, in what we've come to call, the transgender ideology, this militant transgender ideology, where men pretending to be women are invading women's spaces. And so you would expect an outcry from feminists saying this is a no-no. And yet, organized feminism has been either silent or they've sided with the transgender activists. There are exceptions like J.K. Rowling, Helen Joyce, Julie Bindel in the UK. I'm sure there are a few individuals in Australia and then some in America. But these individuals that I just mentioned are not part of an organized feminist group. The ones who are on the streets protesting with Hamas or protesting, taking part in pro-Hamas demonstrations. These, and they label themselves feminists, these are not defending the rights of girls and women. I've been active in this space of, fighting female genital mutilation, honor killings. I don't know if you know what honor killings are. Young Muslim women who want to assimilate into Western society, they are stopped by their families and they are threatened with violence. They are beaten. They are subjected to curfews. And then eventually, if the girl continues on her way of becoming westernized, sometimes she is killed. Feminists who are silent on all of this. Look at what's going on in Iran, where, you have protest after protest led by Iranian women fighting for their rights. And feminists are almost always 100% silent on these issues. So feminism as we know it today, as it's taught in these universities, as you see it in street protests, is not about women. It's not about girls. It's about advancing a different agenda.
Well, that's chilling. Am I right in saying that you've touched on this, Sharia law courts in Great Britain? What legitimacy do they enjoy? Question one, in Britain today. And secondly, I understand that the testimony of a woman in those courts is not equal to the testimony of a man. I may be wrong.
Well, the first question on legitimacy, it seems as if the British government has accepted their existence. And so, for instance, family law in Islam is radically different from family law in a country like Britain. If a woman, she's married according to Sharia, there's a marriage certificate there that, for instance, says it has a word virgin on it. There's a dowry that has to be paid. There's a male guardian. You see, she can't, in Sharia law, she can't just come with her own boyfriend and say, this is the man I want to marry. She's given away by a male guardian. She doesn't even have to be there necessarily. And she's signed from one guardian, her father, to another male guardian, her husband. And if a divorce were to occur within that Sharia context, a man just needs two witnesses, and in front of these two witnesses, he declares, I divorced thee 3 times, and that's the end of the marriage. And there's, child custody, always the children go to him. If there's some inheritance to be had, if a parent dies, the brother gets 100%, she gets 50%. So all of this in a Sharia court, if it is in the West, is not really different from a Sharia court elsewhere. The consequences for the women is exactly the same. To what degree can she then appeal to the, to say to British law? Well, if she's not married according to British law, and she doesn't have that marriage certificate, she cannot appeal to British law. And so de facto, it is legitimized. It for the victim, for the woman concerned. That's just how it is. Now we know about that. There are other things within these courts, other conflicts that are settled. At the moment, I think they're done quietly, but we don't know. I mean, take instances of murder, homicide. I don't know about it, but I know what Sharia law does is that there are these compensations that are negotiated between the family of the victim and the family of the perpetrator. And if such things were to happen, it would all be kept quiet within these ethnic and Islamist communities, and that everybody would be satisfied. So, the country wouldn't even know that such a thing had happened. So, is it the legitimacy aspect of it is this is just how it happens, and then at some point, when the Islamists feel that they are politically strong enough, they will get a vote to say it's legitimate. That's how this group is going to adjudicate their conflicts. They're going to have separate parallel courts, and the rest of society just has to accept it.
That, of course, would be utterly unworkable and lead to the end of Britain today as we know it, and other countries who allow the same thing to happen.
What if the Sikh do it, What if the Catholics come around and say, sorry, we also want to have our own little thing? And so then you just have a splintering and a fragmentation of the nation state. It's very dangerous.
As you look forward then, and keeping in mind, we've referenced this, we are under an obligation to love our neighbours as ourselves. We should not resort to violence. We should not resort or give way to hatred. And yet we ought to defend that which is right and proper and gives people freedom and our children a decent future. And we think that some of these trends are very dangerous, and terrorism in particular just simply, it's not called terrorism for, a poor reason. What is the way forward in your view? What advice would you give a country like Australia where this is now plainly becoming a major problem? I've never known the country to be as divided. There is real anger bubbling away, but blind anger will only make the problem worse.
Yes.
And I'd be the first to say, I don't want to discriminate against people who have different beliefs to me, but by the same token, I believe as an Australian I have an absolute right to say, this is a wonderful country. I don't want the precepts and the institutions that are built on those precepts to be torn down. I don't actually believe that's in anyone's interests. What advice, you will have thought about this a great deal, would you give us?
I would say go back to first principles. So you go back to the foundational principles of Australia. That is the religious foundational principles, the secular, the constitution, the laws, the culture, the norms. Invite all Australians, regardless of their skin color, to abide by those. And those who will not, I think you have to gear up to remove them. That's my advice. And to remove all institutions that they use, the infrastructure that I spoke to you about, of mosques, Islamic schools, youth centers, etc., the identity-shaping, morality-shaping institutions that have now been outsourced to Islamists, you've got to close those down. You've got to stop them now. It sounds radical, but you have brought yourself to a radical place where you have to make these, you have these trade-offs. This is, again, to reference Thomas Sowell, where life is all about trade-offs, and you can't have it both ways. So sometimes you have to choose the lesser evil. And at this point, the lesser evil is a confrontation, an honest confrontation with Muslims in your country. And you say either you accept and embrace Australian law, Australian norms, Australian culture, or you peacefully remove yourself, or we will remove you. That's, I think, where your country is at. And it's not just your country, it's every Western country that has taken in larger numbers of Muslims. You don't have that problem with non-Muslim immigrants from elsewhere. You don't have it with the Vietnamese immigrants, even with the Chinese immigrants. You don't have that problem with the Lebanese Christians. You don't have it with people from India and other parts of the world. Every country seems to have this problem only with the Muslim communities. And therefore, it's not racism, it's not prejudice. In my view, it's self-preservation to have an honest talk with the Muslim communities and their leaders and say, you can't have Sharia. You cannot have, we don't accept that way of life. And then gear up for that, because it's going to be a confrontation.
And I certainly salute your courage. It can't be easy to write and to commentate as you do, but your wisdom, your insights, your deep understanding are remarkable, and we owe you a great debt. Thank you so very much for the illuminating of so much in this conversation.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much.